at all. Moving to a slightly different sector of impact, I think a related one, but one where a different set of laws and principles are also brought into play. It's my pleasure to introduce Joel Charny. He is the Vice President of Humanitarian Policy and Practice and Interaction organization I'm sure you're all familiar with, but a broad network of humanitarian organizations working in probably every country in the world and certainly every disaster and emergency in the world. Joel's work at Interaction involves engaging with the U.S. government, the United Nations, and non-governmental organizations that are members of Interaction on both practical and policy matters. Prior to joining Interaction, Joel was Vice President for Policy with Refugees International, a Washington-based humanitarian advocacy organization, and whilst at RI, he traveled and carried out assessments in a broad number of countries and in many humanitarian emergencies and conflict situations. So Joel, it's a real pleasure to welcome you, and you have the floor.
Thank you. Thanks to the Charity and Security Network for organizing this event and inviting me to be a part of the panel. You filled the room, and that's very impressive. So hopefully we'll have plenty of time for comments and dialogue with you all. As Naz just said, my focus is going to be on the implications of counterterror measures on humanitarian action. And our main concern is that such restrictions undermine our ability to respond to urgent humanitarian situations and directly contradict historic and current U.S. obligations under international humanitarian law. So I'm bringing in the international dimension, but it's a legal dimension involving standards that we've historically recognized with a few brief exceptions. Now, I want to start by being crystal clear that by humanitarian action, I'm referring to the provision of goods that save lives in emergency situations. And even our own community tends to use the term humanitarian more broadly, encompassing not only life-saving action, but reconstruction and development programs as well. And while these programs are vital, and we want to preserve our ability to respond independently and appropriately to a range of needs, life-saving action has the clearest protection under international humanitarian law and thus brings the issue into clearest focus, and that's why I'm going to try and stick with that. Now, this hasn't come up yet, but President Bush's Executive Order 13224, dated September 23rd, 2001, kind of evoked in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 the restrictions on support for designated terrorist organizations, and he had to specifically exempt or rather deny the exemption in the International Emergency Economic Powers Act for, and now I'm quoting, articles, food, clothing, and medicine intended to relieve human suffering. So right at the outset, even though it's built into the International Emergency Economics Powers Act and also the Trading with the Enemy Act dating all the way back to 1917, both laws have exemptions for basically goods to respond to human suffering. And at the outset, post 9/11, that humanitarian exemption was basically abrogated. And to me, this is one of the problems, or there's a consistent pattern about the post 9/11 counterterror measures, is that they've broken with the U.S. historic practice of carving out humanitarian exemptions. So basically, we're going to ignore the exemptions for goods that relieve human suffering. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to very quickly indulge in a quick humanitarian 101 because I think it's important. In responding to urgent needs, humanitarian agencies strive to abide by three core humanitarian principles. First, humanity, which affirms the value of all human life and requires agencies to respond based on objective assessments of need. The second is impartiality, which means that aid providers, having assessed the need, must respond where the need is greatest, regardless of which side in a conflict controls the territory where the most vulnerable people are located. And then third, independence, which means that decisions about the aid response are made based on the internal criteria of the organization, which in turn are grounded in humanity and impartiality, not on the requirements of external actors, whether they're donors, host governments, armed groups, and so on. So humanity, impartiality, and independence are sort of fundamental principles by which we seek to operate. Now, the Geneva Conventions, which the U.S. claims adherence to, are the foundation of international humanitarian law. The entire premise of the Geneva Conventions is that parties to conflict, including non-state actors, must respect the independence of humanitarian action. Humanitarian actors are expected and fully authorized or sanctioned to have contact with and negotiate with parties to the conflict to ensure access to vulnerable people. They're expected to be able to provide life-saving assistance impartially and independently. Therefore, it's impossible to reconcile international humanitarian law with the Holder decision and with specific counterterror measures such as the partner vetting system promulgated by the U.S. Agency for International Development and applied so far only to Gaza. My point is the Obama administration is basically in a complete contradiction that they're apparently unable and unwilling to resolve. Donald Rumsfeld famously said that the Geneva Conventions were quaint, and in essence, we weren't going to pay any attention to them. The Obama administration came in and said, no, 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 we're going to abide by the rules, we're going to fulfill our international responsibilities, including adherence to something so fundamental as the Geneva Conventions. But in the meantime, the administration continues to pursue these counterterror measures that in essence say, no, you cannot go in and talk to Hamas about humanitarian access. You cannot go to Sri Lanka and talk to the Tamil Tigers about the possibility of opening up, corridors or zones for safe passage in the final stages of the war. And again, there's simply no way to reconcile these two positions, and the U.S. seems to be under little pressure to do so. Now, the concrete case I'm going to cite is Somalia. There's been a drought in Somalia for 5 years. Some of you are nodding. Very few are paying attention. 3 million people are at risk. There's a possibility of famine, yet there's been no new USAID assistance to Somalia, including to the World Food Program, since last year due to concerns that aid might be diverted to al-Shabaab. Now, they attempted to put the burden on the non-governmental organizations and UN agencies to collect information about individual staff, partner organizations, and even contractors, all this information to be run through a secret US government terrorist database. Now, this gets into Emily's point, which is I think there's a vast effort to basically try and collect data on every human being on the planet who might be potentially dangerous to the United States. And this is not only in FBI raids in Chicago, this is through the vehicle of this so-called partner vetting system, i.e. we give information about our staff, the staff of organizations that we're working with, and the staff of contractors and vendors. This goes to the government, to USAID. It's run through a secret database, which we have no access to, and if there's a match, we're told there's a match. Now, there are obvious problems with this in a place like Somalia. There's staff security. It would quickly be known that our community was collecting information on behalf of the US government and in essence acting as intelligence agents. There's the potential for the misuse of information. Where does the data go? Are the names going to be retained? Who's going to retain them, including for people who have nothing to do with terrorism? Now, I need Emily and Naz's help on this, but there's the issue of the legality of our accountability to a database that we can't access. We're willing to run names through publicly available databases and abide by the law. But the idea that there's this super duper top secret database with no oversight and accountability, that we feel we cannot accept our own accountability to, not be, how can we be accountable to people whose names are on that list if we can't access the list? And then finally, there's the whole practical problem of false positives, which is just rampant and actually dates all the way back to the 80s when we were worrying about communism in Central America. So there's no shared risk, there's no presumption of good faith. We, the NGO community, have to guarantee that not a grain of rice or a cup of flour will get to anyone affiliated with a terrorist organization in a chaotic and rapidly changing environment. So the microscopic possibility that that cup of rice would do some meaningful strengthening of al-Shabaab to the point that they would actually do damage to the United States, that micro possibility means that we hold up assistance to 3 million people who are on the verge of famine. And it's that, that's just completely against the ethics and values of our community. It just, the risk-reward calculation here is just completely off. Now, I think, again, I want to make sure that there's enough time for comments and questions. We have been able to push back successfully in the Somalia case, and we hope that funding will soon resume, but there's still no sooner, there's this kind of fighting fires thing where no sooner did we have an agreement on Somalia than they started to roll out similar regulations in Afghanistan, and now there's talk of a pilot system for partner vetting in 5 countries, including countries, we could play guess the countries, but 3 of them have absolutely nothing to do with anyone's concept of the war on terror. So again, this is going global, ideally. That's what they'd like to do, go global. And again, I think it's in the interest of getting this massive database of practically every person in the world. Now, at the time, I'm going to invoke President Ronald Reagan in this 100th year anniversary of his birth. Reagan, in 1984, at the time of the Ethiopia famine, famously said, and I quote, "A hungry child knows no politics." And he authorized tens of millions of dollars in U.S. food assistance to communist Soviet-backed Ethiopia. And that was the tradition in the United States, and I think we have a constant struggle before us to keep it that way.